Commemorative events to mark the 70th anniversary of the armistice on the Korean peninsula were covered by foreign media outlets, with quite a few of them pointing to the starkly different atmosphere in the two countries. So how was the event celebrated in South Korea? Why has Russia's delegation to North Korea's celebration triggered much talk? And what looks to top talks among leaders of South Korea, the US and Japan at Camp David later this month? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. It's that time of the week yet again during which we touch upon stories here that made headlines elsewhere as well. For this, I have Nicola Smith here in the studio with me. Nicola, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you.
I also have Thomas Maresca with us. Thomas, it's good to have you here.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Right, Nicola, last Thursday, as I mentioned in the clip, the two Koreas marked the 70th anniversary of the armistice that ended active combat on the Korean peninsula. Now, foreign media, they were very quick to point out the starkly different atmosphere in the two countries. Let's begin with these celebrations here in the country. What were your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it was a very sombre and moving affair, unlike the triumphal celebrations that we saw up north. And there was a strong focus on expressing gratitude to veterans and to allied forces and nations for their sacrifice and their dedication in helping to defend Korea decades ago. And President Yoon led those tributes by saying South Korea today stands on the shoulders of UN forces and on their blood-stained uniforms, which is a very evocative statement. And it was particularly moving to see veterans who were in Busan and who were feted as heroes. They walked down the path of heroes. They were greeted by the president. There was a strong international presence, and so still dozens of veterans are now in their 90s, and so they showed a lot of strength and resilience to be outdoors in this incredible heat in Korea. And I went to Busan myself to do some interviews. I interviewed our armed forces minister, and he was very keen to stress support for the veterans and in showing them that in their standing against, the words he used were a belligerent ideological enemy, that their sacrifice had made a difference. And he pointed out the very stark contrast between the repression that we now see in the north of the border and the economic progress in the south. And speaking to veterans as well, it was a real privilege to speak to a couple of British veterans who were here. One of them was telling me that he hadn't been back since 1953, and he was just flabbergasted by what he saw in Busan and saw the high-rise buildings of modern-day Korea, the technological prowess, and he was thrilled to be here, and he recalls the devastation of the war, and he was so happy to see modern Korea and everything the country's achieved.
Right, and all that achievement thanks to the selfless sacrifice, of course, of the veterans. Meanwhile, Thomas, how did the event here, the commemorative event here, perhaps compare to that up in North Korea, do you think?
Well, it was definitely a very different vibe in North Korea, as Nicola mentioned. You know, it was framed as much more of a celebration up there. It's called Victory Day, and you know, they held a massive military parade, which is kind of the usual. We got to see their latest ICBMs. There was a you know, unveiling or first sighting of a new aerial unmanned you know, drone. But, you know, I think the big takeaway for most observers was the fact that there were delegations from Russia and China in attendance, and, you know, the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, was there, and a member of the Chinese Politburo were there at the, you know, flanking Kim Jong-un at the actual parade, and, you know, the day before they had meetings, and Shoigu went to a defense expo with Kim Jong-un. So clearly, a signal is being sent that, you know, these three countries are kind of tightening up their alliance. You know, this has kind of come on the heels of, there's been a lot of reports of North Korea supplying weapons to Russia. I mean, they've denied it, but there's been, you know, several different reports, and just even recently the Financial Times did a report that Ukraine soldiers were using North Korean rockets on the battlefield, which I guess they had seized from a you know, a Russian ship. You know, there's been talk that obviously the trade, you know, in exchange for food and other supplies to North Korea. And so we're starting to see, more of an alignment. China has also been ramping up its cross-border trade for the first time in a while since the pandemic. So, and also Russia and China have, for several sessions at the UN Security Council, really blocked any efforts to further sanction or even kind of officially condemn North Korea's missile tests. So, we're seeing kind of this alliance that is enabling North Korea to continue with its weapons development program. And that's obviously a message that is being sent to the rest of the world, South Korea and Washington.
Right.
As well.
And talking about messages, Nicola, I understand Thursday was also the first time that Russia's defense minister traveled to North Korea since the collapse of the Soviet Union back in the year 1991. Do you suppose these recent trips by the Russian delegation as well as the Chinese delegation, of course, to North Korea to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the armistice is perhaps a statement of sorts to South Korea and its allies, including the US?
Yes, absolutely. I do think it's signalling. It was a very significant visit, as you said, the first since the fall of the Soviet Union. And Defense Minister Shoigu was welcomed with a red carpet and with a personal tour by Kim Jong-un. So it seems that Russia, North Korea and China, to a certain extent, really see it in each other's interests to counter the growing partnership between South Korea, Japan and the United States. Pyongyang in particular is very worried about what it's seeing in terms of Japan and South Korea growing closer together, and obviously South Korea's growing partnership with the United States when we've had a nuclear-armed submarine come to Busan, and also various joint exercises, and we have the trilateral partnership talks coming up this month. So for Moscow, it also gives them the opportunity to frustrate the US-led efforts to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. The image of Shoigu laughing with Kim Jong-un next to intercontinental ballistic missiles that could be nuclear armed and could strike the United States. Also weapons that are clearly threatening South Korea as well, and new drone technology. So those images were very grim, very stark, and it certainly seemed to show that Russia is not even giving any pretense now to try to be a constructive player in diffusing tensions on the Korean Peninsula. As Thomas said, previously they've backed UN Security Council resolutions about sanctioning North Korea and curbing the nuclear program, and they seem to have given that up, any pretense of trying to follow that. And it could also, on the Russian part, be a signal to President Yoon. He recently went to Ukraine. He pledged more support of non-lethal equipment and humanitarian aid. And that could well be a response to that, but it seems that Seoul, as well as Tokyo, are really readjusting their foreign policy and their risk calculations to counter growing threats to national security and prioritizing what they deem to be the biggest threats.
Right, indeed. And Thomas, as Nicola mentioned, President Yoon Suk-yeol and his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida, as well as US President Joe Biden, are poised to meet at Camp David, I believe, on August 18th. What do you expect will top the agenda then?
Yes, I mean, again, as Nicola mentioned, it's overall, this kind of is a parallel to what we're seeing from the China, Russia, North Korea kind of grouping. We're seeing definitely strengthening ties among Seoul, Washington, Tokyo. Obviously, North Korea is going to be a serious top-level topic of conversation. Beyond that, though, and from what the White House has said, it does, I think, the deepening of the relationship on the defense side they've mentioned sort of, extending the discussion to the regional situation, and they mentioned Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands as areas they're going to discuss, and that has a lot to do with what China is doing in this region. And definitely Washington has been hoping to kind of strengthen this three-way defense alliance in terms of its positioning against China, and obviously Russia is going to be another part of that equation. Japan has definitely, I think, stepped forward more aggressively or more, substantially than maybe some people thought. And South Korea has obviously also participated in supplying, humanitarian and other aid to Ukraine. So, I think those, just in terms of like this repositioning, this geopolitical shifting of powers, we're seeing this relationship, Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington gaining importance, and just kind of a general positioning of the sort of democracy versus authoritarianism framing as well that Biden likes to talk about a lot. I think also we can see that this really reflects the improving or warming relations between Seoul and Tokyo. I mean, the thought of this happening, within recent years is almost impossible to imagine. And I think this is the first time they've actually had a trilateral, like an official trilateral summit, not a sideline event. And that has a lot to do with the Yoon administration and the Kishida administration kind of, making an effort. It hasn't always been popular here domestically, but, they've certainly have strengthened their security and, I think other forms of cooperation going forward. And, this also will extend into just kind of economic security issues. There's a lot happening in supply chains and, this sort of semiconductor controls that Washington is trying to impose on Beijing. So, I think that, it has this, North Korea may be a kind of a focal point, but it has a really wide-ranging.
Right, they have quite a lot on their plate, these three leaders to discuss, of course. And with regard to North Korea's persistent pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, Nicola, and speaking within your capacity as a journalist who has been covering tensions here on the Korean Peninsula, do you suppose that there are other options that need to be further explored in efforts to discourage such nuclear ambitions by North Korea?
Well, that's a very difficult question, and not one that I would presume to know the answer to. It's taken decades to not find a solution. And since I've been in this region, we've gone through several cycles. So I arrived in 2016 in Taiwan, and since then there's been the fire and fury and then that moved on to Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un and President Moon Jae-in having their historic talks. Those didn't go anywhere either, and now we're back to the spiraling tensions part of that cycle. And it's been very clear through all of this that no matter whether you're talking or not, Kim Jong-un does not want to give up his nuclear weapons because this is his security guarantee, and he believes that his own life, his own dynasty could be in danger if he does so. So that leaves you with the question of how to resolve this issue. And there is a school of thought among US academics in particular that one possibility could be just to accept and to recognize North Korea as a nuclear state. But that obviously would be very problematic. It would be very difficult politically for governments. It would cause a lot of alarm in the region. It may also encourage other parts of the world to move towards nuclear proliferation. And so it could be that Kim Jong-un currently is biding his time and waiting to see what happens in the next US elections and where he stands with the next US administration, whether he might consider coming back to the table. But for now, it seems that the best option is to double down on deterrence and basically strengthening alliances, showing the potential cost of taking drastic and foolish action. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing with nuclear submarine visiting Busan, with the trilateral talks and with joint military drills.
Right, we are. Thomas, what do you care to add with regard to perhaps proposing a fresh, constructive approach to addressing North Korea's nuclear ambitions?
It's, Nicola definitely covered a lot of the basic problems with trying to move the ball forward. For me, I think I've been here around the same time frame that she was mentioning in terms of kind of the fire and fury into the Trump era of diplomacy. I feel that now it's really hard to see any movement. The way things really do seem kind of locked into place, and with what we were talking about earlier, now that Russia and China are seem to be leveling up to some extent their support of North Korea, that seems to give Pyongyang more of a runway as it's developing its nuclear weapons. I mean, Kim Jong-un clearly is not interested in responding to any kind of overtures from South Korea or Washington to sit down at the negotiating table. I mean, clearly, they seem, North Korea seems to have a very specific end goal or a series of developments that they want to, nail down, I think, before they have any interest in talking again, proving that they can perhaps mount and deliver a nuclear warhead, maybe proving their tactical nuclear weapons capability for their capacity to strike South Korea. As Nicola mentioned, I'm sure that they're kind of keeping an eye on the US election. I mean, that could certainly change the geopolitical atmosphere quite a bit. I would say that China clearly has probably the most potential influence on North Korea, but we're also not really seeing them. They seem to be more kind of using North Korea or going along with North Korea at the moment, and maybe that somehow fits into where they're, positioning themselves. So it's really tough. I mean, it does almost feel like it's this Cold War era, kind of frozen. I mean, but it's a weapon, it's an arms race, almost weapons buildup. I mean, the South and the U.S. are clearly showing a greater, determination to be aggressive in deterrence, and they're responding sort of every time North Korea does another weapons test. And it's I think there is also a train of thought that maybe this just ends up resolving itself by something happening internally in North Korea. I mean, the North is clearly using a lot of its resources to develop its weapons program at the expense of just food supplies and just living conditions for its people. So, I mean, I don't know how explicitly this will be stated either, but I think there is some sense that maybe pushing that, keeping that rolling will kind of exacerbate situations within Pyongyang. Otherwise, I think it's, unless something big happens, maybe we have to wait for another kind of milestone event to revisit.
Right, hopefully another 6-party talks then. I remember thinking back then when I was covering it was a daunting task they had, but now if you think about it, we were maybe a step closer to seeing some kind of diffusing tensions than we are right now.
It's hard to imagine all those parties
coming
back together again. I mean, we are seeing this, like China and Russia were at a different, place in those days. Now it's like clearly they've
right,
indeed drawn a line. Yeah,
of course. Nicola, let's now move on to a concerning but more domestic-centered issue. Korea's population shrank for the second year in a row in 2022 amid a critically low birth rate, according to Statistics Korea last Thursday. Based on your observation here in the country, Nicola, what do you propose to deal with this particular challenge?
That's another big challenge, another big question. Really, there's no quick fix. It has to be a response from the whole of society, not just government. And South Korea may actually be looking now at mitigation measures as well, rather than trying to reverse this dire birth rate scenario. That said, there are certain measures that can be taken, and the government has said that the next 5-year window is critical. They've suggested things like reducing a tax burden on gifts to young newlyweds. There's obvious things that you can do in terms of making more affordable childcare options, and also looking at housing and trying to make more available and affordable housing for young couples, for young people who are finding it very difficult to put up, especially with huge deposits, to just rent a place. So those are the kind of things that you could look at. But also there has to be a change in workplace culture as well, and that's really on private companies to encourage employees to have a better work-life balance, to encourage women to come back to work after they've given birth. Because you look at young women now and they spend so much time studying, it's a very competitive environment. They pour all of their energy and efforts into getting good results in their exams, getting a good job, and then very often they're expected to give that up when they have a child. And so that kind of atmosphere has to change, just the societal the societal approach to women and how they take on more of the burden of household chores and raising the children, and also the education system. There's so much pressure on children in the education system that there was a recent survey among young parents saying about 50% of them said they didn't want the same education pressures for their children that they'd faced. And so that's something that really needs to be looked at, because there's also a lot of pressure on the parents to then pay up a lot of money for cram schools. And that's something that's certainly a disincentive to having children. And then finally, I would say that Korea does have to look more at easing immigration restrictions as well. And that would be part of the mitigation strategy, and not just to allow foreign nannies to come here, but just in the wider sense of immigration.
Right, and staying with what Nicola just mentioned, Thomas, there is talk here in the country about introducing foreign nannies to encourage couples to have more children. What are your thoughts?
Right, well, the Ministry of Labor actually did announce a pilot program this week, and it will be around 100 foreign domestic workers from a range of countries, I think mostly Southeast Asia, like Philippines seems to be one of the major ones. You know, it's going to be like a 6-month trial, I guess. You know, again, it's more on the lines of a mitigation measure. I mean, I think it does also, as Nicola mentioned, you know, just getting more foreign workers in Korea in general is going to be, you know, something that needs to be looked at, I think, going forward. You know, how much this is going to move the needle, I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to see, because I wonder, obviously there is a need for childcare support. I think when they announced this pilot program, they were talking about how, you know, the current wave of existing domestic workers are sort of aging out, you know, and there's not really like a demand from younger local people to fill those jobs. You know, and anything, I think, to ease the burden of working women in terms of childcare would be welcomed. You know, I don't know how much Korean parents are going to really embrace this. I mean, to be honest, there's you know, when push comes to shove, there hasn't been a great sort of acceptance or integration of, you know, foreign, like immigration communities in Korea in general, and especially something so close to home. I mean, I have read there are some, you know, people do express some concerns about that. You know, it will be interesting to see. I don't think it's going to be something that majorly moves the needle. You know, and again, as Nicola mentioned, a lot of these other sort of programs that could need to be, I think, implemented to try and make it easier for people to have children. I mean, the only other thing I would add to that is that when you look at developed countries in, say, Europe that have higher, you know, birth rates, a lot of times, you know, that coincides with just greater gender equality, greater acceptance of non-traditional families. I mean, here it's very hard for, you know, unmarried couples can't adopt, you know, and single parents are sort of looked down upon, not to mention same-sex marriage. So those kinds of family structures and just, you know, the ability for women to have, you know, not carry all the burden of raising children and feel that they're sacrificing their careers. You know, like countries like France or Nordic countries seem to have, you know, maintained a higher level of birth rate, even though they're as economically developed. And so that seems, you know, that's pointed to as one of the key factors, which is not easy to, you know, wave your hand and change in the society, but.
Right, of course not. But as long as we know that talk has started and discussions are being undertaken, we can hope for some best results in the near future then.
Well, we can hope for it, for sure.
Fingers crossed for that. All right, then, as always, thank you very much, Thomas, for your time and your thoughts. And Nicola, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we end this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow, that is Thursday.